Welcome everyone to our newest YouTube video. We're the Dimitrov-Boulay piano duo. My name is Dimitri Dimitrov.
And my name is Elvira Boulay.
And today we're going to talk about intervals. And more specifically, we're going to talk about how to balance when you're playing intervals. As you know, music has a melody, has an accompaniment, has intervals, has chords. Today, we also talk about how to balance intervals, and in some of our future videos, we'll also talk about how to balance chords. Now, as you know already, we as pianists have an enormous literature to choose from. And while we have pieces that have just a singular melody, just a melodic line without any other voices, we also have pieces where we have two or more voices. Now today, as I said, we're going to talk about intervals. That means that you are going to have to play two voices together, and we're going to discuss how to balance those two voices. Because it's not a good idea to play them at the same volume, right?
Yes, exactly. And piano is unique in the sense that with no other instruments you can play so many notes at the same time. Which means that you need to learn how to balance those notes that you're playing so that they don't all sound at the same volume and your listener doesn't hear just a lot of notes, a lot of noise, but actually can distinguish the melody and the accompaniment and the voices that are less important.
And basically, playing a piano means that you have more or less an orchestra at your disposal. You can do so many things. So it's wonderful to think about that when you are already at the level where you can play more than one voice and more than two voices, etc. The more voices you play, the more you have to think about how do you balance all those voices. I don't want to get too much into theory about voicing and about chords and stuff, but one of the most important things you can think about is very often when you have two voices, you would have a leading voice, which is the melodic voice, which would be actually the more important voice, and you will have a secondary voice, which is the feeling. By feeling, what I mean is when you have several different voices, when you combine the left and the right hand, you have two important voices, melody at the top, bass at the bottom, to put it very, very simply, and inside you will have the feeling, the notes that actually support everything else and fill it up. But you would always have to have voices that are more important and voices that are less important. That's how we understand where the bass is and where the melody is. And you can imagine that if you have primary voices and secondary voices, it would be a shame to play them all at the same level, because you would not, as a listener, you first of all as a player, and also the listener who is listening to you, wouldn't be able to understand what to listen to. Everything would be a big jumble of notes, and so it wouldn't be as interesting. It would be heavier to listen to, etc.
How I like to imagine it is if you are watching a movie, you have a main character, or if you're reading a book, you have a main character who has a lot to say, who has a big role, and then you have secondary characters. And if you're a movie creator, and you give the secondary characters as big of a role as the main character, nobody would want to watch your movie because it's confusing and it's too long and it's boring. So, in all things, I think you have this kind of distinction between what is most important and then what's less important and so on.
Yeah, and I think, of course, right now we'll move to the piano and I can show you then in practice, because then you can really understand what I mean when I show you what happens if you play two voices at the same volume, that it's so different than actually if you balance them nicely and show the listener what's more important. Like you mentioned, in a book or a movie, the producer, the director of the movie they show you in a way who is the main character, and you start liking this character or hating this character, and that's what it is with music. You show the listeners what to listen to. Now, let's get straight to the examples.
So as an example, I chose Clair de Lune. You probably all know it. And in the beginning, actually, the melody is part of the interval. You're not playing a separate melody, but in this case, the upper voice of the interval is the melody. And I want you, as a first step, to always, whenever you see an interval, to check for yourself, is it part of a melody or is it just accompaniment? So now you know that in an interval can be actually the melody in the upper or sometimes lower voice. In this case, in the Clair de Lune, the melody is in the upper voice of the interval. So every time, the upper voice of the interval is the melody. Now, if I don't balance the intervals properly, as a listener, you're not going to be able to distinguish the melody. So, let me try to do that. Let me try to not balance them. Now, I don't know if you could hear the difference. I think there's a very clear difference. But in bar 3, for example, these high notes come completely out of nowhere if you don't actually play the melody before that. It just sounds like a bunch of pretty notes, but you don't know actually what to listen to. So first tip for me is always check your intervals and also chords, but we'll talk about that another time. Check if they are actually part of a melody. Is there a melody hidden in them? That's the first step. And then as a second tip, I would say to you, try playing instead of, because balancing is pretty tricky if you're not used to it, try playing them with separate hands. So with that I mean try playing the upper voice of the interval with your right hand and the lower voice of the interval with your left hand. I'm going to demonstrate that now. So I'm going to play this, what I usually play in the right hand only, I'm going to play with left and right. And I'm playing the right hand louder because that's the melody voice. See how easy I'm able to balance it now. This is a great exercise for you to be able to hear how actually this interval should be balanced. How should it be balanced if you weren't stopped by technical difficulties, you know? So I think that's the 2 tips that I have for you. The first one is consider the possibility that any interval could be part of the melody. Check that first before you just play it. And then second of all, try playing these intervals with separate hands. Play the top voice with the right hand and the lower voice with your left hand. Now Dimitar is going to continue with some great tips.
Everything Elvira said up till this point is a lie. Let's start over. When you have intervals, one of the notes usually can be a melody. Oh, wait, that's what you said. As an example, I chose a piece that I'm practicing myself. I've recorded some parts on Instagram from this piece. Some of you who are on Instagram know. And so you can see that I have thirds. Again, here, the upper note is the note that's melodic. And so we want that upper note to be a little bit more dominant than the lower note. But I want to get immediately to some tips because that's the most important. One of the things that you can do that I always think it works, first of all, everything that we do here is to teach you everything, I mean, as examples, everything we do is to teach you and your ears, basically you will be teaching your ears what to listen to. Once you know what you have to listen to and you teach your ears by practicing correctly, you will start automatically changing and developing this habit of being able to play one note more than the other. So now the example I'm going to give you is exactly going to teach you that. You are going to play only the upper note with the right fingering. So for example, I didn't do that because I don't need it at this point to do that. But very often, most likely people who are amateurs or who start with piano or not so advanced yet, they will need to do that. I did it as a child. And so I have to think now, what is the right finger? In this case, it's a very natural fingering. So what I mean is, you have to play only the upper voice, but you have to do it with the right fingering. And so it will sound like this. You can do it with or without the left hand, and you will do this. And so when you do this, you will teach your ear what to listen to. That's the most important note. You can do only the right hand as well. Now, when you do this a couple of times, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to play the lower voice. But you're not only going to play it, you remember that it is the lower note is the less dominant voice, and so you have to play it less dominantly. That means that you have to play it softer than this. And remember that lower voice has to be played also with the right fingering. So again, write in the score if you don't know what the right fingering is, because one of the most common mistakes I see is I say play the lower voice, people play it with random fingering. That's never going to work, because you want that to actually to have some resemblance of what you're going to do later on. So if you play it with random fingering, you're not going to develop the proper technique. And so I look at the proper fingering and I play the lower voice softer. Then you can do again the upper, and then the lower, and then try together. You're doing great. I mean, I'm doing great. And one more tip. When you do the separate voices, you can do this. It's a very, very good exercise. You have two voices again. We have intervals, harmonic intervals they're called, by the way. And what you're going to do is you're going to turn them into melodic intervals. Instead of doing this, you're going to do this. Do you recognize what I'm doing? I'm basically playing them one after another, as you can hear, but I'm also trying to create the dynamic that I want to have later on when I play them as harmonic intervals. So I press first the upper note a little bit louder, then the lower, softer, louder, softer, louder, softer, louder, softer, louder, softer, louder, softer. You can do the opposite, vice versa. You can start with the soft, loud, soft, loud, soft, loud, soft, loud. Now you might ask, how is this going to help me? It's going to help you enormously, because you're teaching your ears what to listen to. You're teaching your physical contact with the keyboard, how to approach each voice. And so after some time, you're going to be able, when you attempt to play both notes together, you automatically start attempting to play one of the voices more. And over time, this is going to help, and you're going to have a better balance. Now, with all these tips, there is one thing that's very important. All this, what I said and what Elvira said, is not going to work if you're not patient. What we see in our experience very, very often, actually more often than we would like to see that, is that people are impatient. What they do is, you tell somebody, for example, do this, slowly listen to the lower voice, very peacefully. I'll try to replicate what students would do. Good luck finding a right balance like this. Is not going to work. You have to be patient, you have to take your time and explore. And listen, are you satisfied? Are they a different balance? Are they a different sound? Do you have forte and piano, as we call it? Because this is doing nothing. So with all these tips, if you don't have patience, if you're not in it for the sake of the process and enjoying experiencing how to develop this skill, because it is a skill, you're not going to get good results if you're doing it quickly, if you're not conscious, if you're not aware of what you are doing, and if you're not listening to what you're doing. And yes, so that would be my conclusion. I'm sure that Elvira would agree with this, that without patience and without being deliberate and conscious in what you do, it's not going to work.
Yeah, I think there are things in music that just take quite some time, and I remember this particularly balancing voices. I remember this as the first time my teacher told me, I thought he was joking because I simply thought it's impossible. And I think that gives a really good image of how difficult I found it then.
And so yeah, this is our last advice for you. None of these advices are going and tips are going to work for you if you don't do them properly, if you don't have the time, if you don't take the time to develop that, but they work enormously. That's what we did as children. And yeah, this would be all for our video for today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button because that will help us enormously. If you have friends, I hope you do, you can share it with your friends and family, this video. That would help us also. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.